If it's Tuesday, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy floats an impeachment inquiry into the current president as Republicans defend the former president, now awaiting a possible third criminal indictment. Plus, a major shakeup for Team DeSantis. The presidential contender is bleeding staff as he tries to reset a struggling campaign by cutting more than 40% of his staff. And honoring Emmett Till, President Biden announces a national monument commemorating the 14-year-old boy whose torture and lynching in 1955 helped galvanize the civil rights movement. Hello and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles, in today for Kristen Welker, reporting from Washington, where we're still on indictment watch as the Republican frontrunner Donald Trump awaits potential charges in a third criminal case. And with a live look at the entrance to the D.C. courthouse, we're continuing to learn more about the scope of Jack Smith's investigation into 2020 election interference. On Sunday, the special counsel received tens of thousands of documents from Rudy Giuliani's associate, Bernard Kerik. And former Trump acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue says that he was interviewed by the special counsel's office. And just minutes ago, we confirmed that Chris Krebs, the former head of the nation's cybersecurity agency under DHS, also spoke with the special counsel. But amid the threat of Donald Trump's indictment, Republicans on the Hill have another I word on their minds: impeachment. Last night on Fox, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy made comments suggesting House Republicans were planning an impeachment inquiry to investigate their allegations tied to the Biden family. Now, I spoke with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy this afternoon as he answered questions from reporters, and I asked him why he thought such a dramatic step was actually necessary. Here's some of what he told me.
What would an impeachment inquiry allow congressional investigators, oversight committees, and judiciary committees to already have?
So what an impeachment inquiry does, it gives us the apex of the power of Congress for Republicans and Democrats to gather the information that they need. So when we're continuing that, you raise a question like this, wondering what's right or wrong, you would want the truth as well, just as you're covering it for the American public. What that simply provides is that the American public has a right to know, and this allows Congress to get the information to be able to know the truth.
McCarthy also tried to shoot down any suggestion that an impeachment inquiry would be politically motivated. The White House has dismissed the potential for an impeachment inquiry, calling it a distraction from real issues. But it comes just after last month when McCarthy had to defuse an unexpected push within his caucus to impeach Biden, specifically over his handling of border issues. McCarthy opposed the effort, calling it premature. This time, House Republicans are focusing on Hunter Biden's legal troubles, as the president's son is expected to plead guilty to 2 tax-related misdemeanors tomorrow as part of a plea deal with federal prosecutors. Republicans have expressed disappointment and outrage at the scope of those charges, pointing to allegations from a pair of IRS whistleblowers who testified that the president's son received special treatment from prosecutors. The Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in charge of the case has pushed back on those claims and is now offering to publicly testify before Congress this fall. The Republican scrutiny of Hunter Biden's actions comes as today Business Insider reports that Hunter Biden's gallery sold art to a Democratic donor who was also appointed by Biden to a commission at a public agency. So far, the Republican focus on allegations around the Biden family, a number of them so far unproven, amounts to mostly smoke. But they are clearly intent on fanning those flames as a raging fire faces their field's frontrunner, Donald Trump. NBC's Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill. Also with us, NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. Sahil, let's start with you. Speaker McCarthy has been pretty cautious about the talk of impeachment, this despite the fact that some of the right-wing members of his caucus aren't quite there yet. What do you take from his comments last night and then what he said today?
Well, Ryan, it's a major step by Speaker McCarthy for the first time opening the door to an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Now, in those remarks to you, he did make clear that an impeachment inquiry is not impeachment, but that may be a technical distinction without a whole lot of meaning for the simple reason that can anyone think of an impeachment inquiry in modern times that didn't lead to actual impeachment? Didn't happen with Donald Trump. That did lead to impeachment. Didn't happen with Bill Clinton. That did lead to impeachment. Once you start, once this train starts moving, it tends not to stop. And McCarthy has been as you know, facing a lot of pressure from his right flank to begin impeachment proceedings, if not an impeachment inquiry first, into Biden for a while. This follows a familiar pattern where McCarthy initially resists, and then the pressure dials up, and he ultimately gives in. One thing that even his hard-right members recognize is that you need to make the case to the American public for impeachment in order to end up coming out ahead politically. Let's have a listen to what Congressman Andy Biggs said about that.
I would say we probably should, before we talk about impeachment, move on to an impeachment inquiry to actually get more teeth into our investigations and allow us to expand and broaden those investigations and use to bring more witnesses, bring in more evidence. I'll just tell you that the evidence that I've seen is overwhelming, and it would lead one to believe that our sitting president, is corrupted.
Now, these Republicans are old enough to remember the impeachment case involving Bill Clinton in the 1990s, when the public saw it ultimately as a shallow, partisan exercise, ended up punishing Republicans in the following election. Speaker McCarthy certainly understands that as well, which is why he had been resisting, at least up until now. And then there's Congressman Ralph Norman, who predicts that at the end of the day, Biden will be impeached. For some Republicans, they've already made up their minds. It's just a question of how they get there.
All right, Mike, let's go to you now. There may not be much fire here, but there is a heck of a lot of smoke. And the White House's instinct here is just to brush this stuff off, saying it's a non-story. Is that a sustainable strategy? And what are we going to hear from them tomorrow when Hunter Biden is in court?
Well, Ryan, I don't think we're going to hear much from the White House tomorrow. It's interesting you compare what we may hear tomorrow with what was said by the White House when Hunter entered into this plea agreement about a month ago, and it was simply a statement of support from the president and the first lady for their son. If there is a statement tomorrow, I expect it would echo that. It's clear to many in the White House and those in the early stages of the Biden campaign that there is a Biden who Republicans are hoping to put on the ballot next year, and it's Hunter Biden. It seems that most of the energy and the noise coming from Capitol Hill seems to be trying to somehow get the president enmeshed with his son's legal issues and really to put smoke, as you say, and try to link him with some of these issues as well. The White House is firmly convinced that the American people, not necessarily those who are watching cable news or those who are partisans on either side, are going to see this as a distraction at a time when the president intends to continue traveling the country, talking about what he's done legislatively, what he's done to improve the economy. That's where the White House is going to continue to try to put its focus. It really is remarkable to think about this, Ryan. We remember I was working on Capitol Hill as well during 2018, 2019, when Democrats rather reluctantly walked into impeaching former president, then President Donald Trump. At the time, we remember there was an impeachment trial happening in the Senate at the same time as Joe Biden, then a candidate for president, was out on the campaign trail. And he often found it a distraction from the message that he was going out trying to deliver to voters. It does seem now a Republican Congress is much more aligned with the goals of the Republican candidates for president in terms of what an impeachment inquiry and process might ultimately mean for those running to challenge Biden next year. It's a very different picture than what we saw in 2020.
Okay, so Sahil, let's talk about the U.S. attorney in the Hunter Biden case, David Weiss. He's offered to publicly testify. He's been criticized by some of what the whistleblowers told the House. I mean, what could his potential testimony mean? Could he clear the record?
It certainly seems like he is a significant witness, Ryan, because the House Republicans' entire case, hinges on this idea, the allegation that he was muzzled, that there was improper bias from the Attorney General, maybe even some have suggested President Biden himself, because his son was involved, that the U.S. Attorney was not allowed to bring the charges that he should have. Now, U.S. Attorney Weiss, remember, he was appointed by Donald Trump. He stayed on in the Biden administration. He's rejected this narrative entirely. He said he was at no point, he had never been denied the authority to bring charges in any jurisdiction. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, has also rejected the Republican claims that at no point was U.S. Attorney Weiss told no. So he does make for an awkward witness for Republicans because he contradicts the narrative, which he is entirely in the center of. He has offered, or rather his team has offered, to testify in a couple of dates in September, a couple of dates in October, saying that is when this matter involving Hunter Biden will have concluded. That's when it becomes appropriate to do it. So far, Republicans have not accepted, at least that we know of. I have asked the office of Jim Jordan, the Judiciary Committee chairman, whether they will say yes to Weiss.
And McCarthy did respond to it a bit today, saying he thought maybe it would be too long to wait until the fall to hear from the U.S. Attorney. So, Mike, the two newest drips the White House contending with today, this insider report that connected Biden donors bought Hunter's artwork for an exorbitant amount of money. And then there's this New York Post story that claims a Hunter friend said that the president was on speakerphone with Hunter's business contacts. Is this another example of the White House just not responding to these reports?
Yeah, Ryan, as we speak, we're awaiting the press briefing from Karine Jean-Pierre, in which the White House will no doubt be faced with some of these questions. At the moment, they continue to dismiss these questions or not address them directly whatsoever. The president has been pretty definitive, at least as it relates to whether, and as he says, there is no relationship in terms of his son's business dealing. That's been a bright line that the president himself has articulated. As it relates to whether individuals are purchasing his son's artwork and then finding their way onto a board, we should note that there are a number of presidential commissions, and many of them have a very thin vetting process. Donors often find their ways onto them. It might be hard to necessarily link a purchase of artwork to being selected for one of these boards, but it gives the president's critics significant ammunition.
And it's a volunteer board, although still prestigious for sure. All right, Sahil and Mike, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it. Let's get to our panel now. Joining me on set, political congressional correspondent Nicholas Wu. And Nick and I work together every single day. I promise I know who he is. Democratic strategist and senior advisor on the Strategic Victory Fund, Stephanie Schriock, and Republican strategist Brad Todd. So since I butchered your name, Nick, I'm going to start with you. Speaker McCarthy says the only way that Congress can possibly get to the truth of all this evidence related to the Biden family is through an impeachment inquiry. But that certainly raises the stakes quite a bit, doesn't it?
It does. And to a certain degree, though, we have to remember that this is about semantics, right? Like whether this is, they call it an impeachment inquiry, or if it's, just a broader congressional investigation into the Biden family, right? It kind of is ultimately up to the speaker and his allies. Now, the question I think that will be interesting here, though, is when it does come time for the to all come before the full House, is this something that the House Republican Conference is going to go for, right? Remember, there's 18 Republicans from districts that Biden won. Do these folks really want to go down this road quite yet? Not to mention the fact that it's the last week that the House is in session. They're about to head back for their August recess, right? It's a time when folks normally want to go and talk about their wins. Is this the kind of thing they want to talk about in town halls?
Could you say the same thing could be said about this potential resolution to expunge the Trump impeachments? It's also a very narrow majority. If you're an at-risk Republican, say, in upstate New York, do you want to cast that vote?
It's a really tough vote for a lot of Republicans, and not just among moderates, right? There's some of the constitutional conservatives in the Republican conference have spoken about how they don't even believe that an expungement is something that they could vote on, since there was no conviction to expunge in the first place.
It's not a real thing, right? So Brad, we have evidence that failed impeachments have actually made candidates and sitting presidents stronger. That certainly happened with President Clinton, happened with President Trump, at least for a certain period of time. At the moment, the evidence against Joe Biden appears to be weak. It's just a lot of smoke, as we've said before. But would this put some Republicans in a tough spot if they were to proceed with this?
Well, I don't know if I want to agree with you on the fact that it's weak. I mean, when he was a candidate, Joe Biden said that he never talked to Hunter about his business. Now we know that's not true.
Well, that's not true. We don't know that. This is just a report. We haven't actually heard from the individual who has claimed to have said this.
It's very clear he was aware of Hunter's business at a minimum. How he became aware of it, maybe someone else told him besides Hunter, I find that unlikely. Second, we said during the campaign that Hunter never took money from China. We now know that's untrue. So there are a lot of questions left to be asked. I'm not sure Republicans end up with impeachment, but these are some egregious charges that have been leveled about the investigation by investigators saying they were held back. Congress should continue to look for the facts. And if that means letting people know impeachment's on the horizon to maybe increase the compliance with the requests that Congress has been making since March, maybe that's a step Kevin McCarthy has to take.
Okay, so Stephanie, to Brad's point, I mean, there is a steady drip of stories related to the Biden family. Maybe not all of them have hard evidence connected to them, but the Republican megaphone, particularly on conservative social media, is very loud, and they're going to continue to push these. Do you think the Biden team, the White House, needs to do more to push back?
Well, the Republicans are clearly focused on this because they just can't find anything else to talk about at the moment, it seems like. And this has been the case from the very beginning when it comes to everything around Hunter Biden. But I think the president has made a very clear red line. We don't know exactly what, to your point, what the facts are here. But the truth of the matter is that it's Joe Biden and his record as president that's going to be on this ballot. And he's traveling around the country talking about the economy while everybody else is going to go home and have to deal with impeachment conversations or expungement conversations. I agree with Nick. I just don't think the Republicans want to have this conversation right now, particularly going into August recess. I also don't think McCarthy has the votes to do any of this stuff, so it puts you in all kinds of a pickle when you can't get anything done.
But hasn't the red line changing? I mean, Karine Jean-Pierre has been saying now that he's not in business with his son, but previously it was he's never talked about his son's business with him, and he didn't make money from China. I mean, this is moving very quickly towards something that's very, very narrow. And so it seems to me if the White House really believes that Joe Biden is clear on this, they should be talking about it a lot. They should be providing a lot more records than they're providing. They should be sending people to Congress willfully testifying. If they think the facts clear them, then they should cooperate.
Do Democrats that you talk to on the House that maybe don't want to be on the record, but you talk to quietly, Nick, do they agree with Brad's point? Be as transparent as possible. Do everything you possibly can to try and tamp out this smoke if it exists.
I think for the Democrats I've talked to, the Hunter Biden business is something that is a headache that a lot of them wish would just go away. And
it's not going to. I have a message for them. It's not going to. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the tricky part of crisis comms here, right? Do you put more out there? Do you try to respond in kind, or do you take the tack that this White House has, right, where you kind of try to sit above the fray, let the legal process play out? And I think at least so far, Democrats on the Hill haven't signaled that they want any kind of change in strategy, since I think for now they're fine with the way the White House is playing it. But of course that could change as more revelations come out, and this could potentially become more damaging to Democrats.
Okay.
But we have had a Hunter Biden who has been working with everything and going through this process. It's not like anybody is dodging things. I mean, we got Donald Trump every day refusing to work with anybody in the legal system. So you've got very different environments going on here. And I think that's why we let some of this play out.
All right, so Stephanie, that gets us to this conversation about how Donald Trump fits into all of this and how the indictments that he's facing could impact him in a possible race. And Monmouth did a poll that asked, would you be concerned that these indictments could weaken Donald Trump in a campaign against President Biden? This is what Republican voters said. Some said 11% would make them somewhat concerned, or very concerned, 16% somewhat concerned. But look at the numbers for not too concerned, 25% and 47%. Brad, as a Republican strategist, does that concern you? Is this reflective of where the Republican primary is? Should Republican primary voters be more worried about sending a potential primary winner to a general election with this legal baggage?
Here's the perspective of Republican primary voters. Since 2016, Democrats have tried to invalidate, minimize, delegitimize the 2016 election. Republican voters don't think that's about Donald Trump. They think that's about them. They think that Democrats have tried to delegitimize their choice to reject Hillary Clinton. So because we've had 7 straight years of Democrats trying to cast doubt on whether Donald Trump was legitimately elected president, I think Republican voters now see all this by prosecutors who were either appointed or elected as Democrats as just another political stunt.
So you're saying that the prosecutors involved in the indictment are...
I think Republican
voters... the judge is a Trump appointee.
I think Republican voters see the fact that every one of these indictments has been brought by someone who is elected or appointed as a Democrat, regardless of the judge. I think that's what primary voters see. That was your question?
Okay, so no, but my question is, what do general election voters think of this? And should Republican primary voters be concerned that general election voters may view it differently?
Well, electability's never been much of a selling point in a Republican primary. And so I don't know that primary voters vote that way. They don't think what an independent's going to think. They vote on
maybe Democrats don't either, right?
Right. Yeah. That's partisans. That's the way partisans act in primaries. Electability is a thing political people in Washington talk about, not voters.
Yeah. Okay, so 69% of Republican voters still believe that Trump would be their strongest candidate against Biden. Stephanie, what does that tell you?
That you've got a Republican base that is very much solidly with Donald Trump, and it does not matter. In fact, any more indictments, which are clearly coming down, it appears, are just going to solidify his position because they feel like he's being unfairly attacked. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, this is actually a judicial process with folks who are looking into these allegations, grand juries deciding that there should be indictments coming down. So this is a real problem for the Republican Party. I don't know how they get out of it, to be honest with you. I mean, I think you could have a convicted nominee going into a convention. Could be very interesting next summer.
All right, so, Nick, I want to talk about one of the most active spenders in political campaigns this month, and that's the Club for Growth. Their affiliated Win It Backpack. They have this new ad. Let's play it.
definitely was the right man in 2016. We needed to change. He would have been the right man in 2020 because of those policies that he would have continued. By now, in 2024, it's just time for new blood.
Time for new blood. We just played the polls that show that Republican primary voters aren't interested in new blood. Is this an effective message?
Well, I think for the Club for Growth, this is where we see them trying to pivot towards a general election message. I mean, this is a group that's always been about trying to elect more conservative Republican candidates, and time for new blood. This is just the tricky balancing act of, I think, any presidential campaign right now on the Democratic side or the Republican side, right? It's time for new blood, but not necessarily the guy at the top.
Brad?
25% of Republican voters actively want someone besides Donald Trump. 40% of the Republican primary voters are shopping. They're interested. They have not yet seen a candidate who could replace the things they like about Trump, but they have misgivings. Trump has about 35% they're going to vote for him against their own mother. And so 35% is a pretty good starting point. But as soon as anybody succeeds, if they can succeed in coalescing that 40% in the middle, the 25% who were actively looking for someone else will come around. I don't know if that's going to happen. Thus far, Trump's out campaigning everybody he's campaigning against. And so I don't know if that's going to happen.
Stephanie, just quickly, do you agree? Is it too late? Is there an opening for someone not named Trump in the Republican primary?
There's always an opening in a primary process. I truly believe that. But right now, it looks like it's getting harder and harder because they feel very protective of him. Mm-hmm. They feel very protective, and that's going to be hard to break.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Nicholas, Stephanie, Brad, great conversation. We appreciate you all being here. Thank you. Up next, DeSantis destaffs. We have breaking news from the campaign trail as the Republican presidential hopeful lays off even more staff. We'll go to the reporter who broke the story for us next. Plus, the latest developments amid that global heat wave, from wildfires ravaging Greece to the unprecedented 101-degree water temperatures off Miami Beach, and what comes next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As Florida Governor Ron DeSantis works to reset his sputtering presidential campaign, he will have to do it with a lot fewer staffers. NBC News has confirmed that the DeSantis campaign has fired more than 40% of its original staff after concerns about how fast it was burning through cash. The news was first reported by Politico. DeSantis spokesperson Janera Peck, she's the campaign manager, told NBC in a statement, following a top-to-bottom review of our organization, we have taken additional aggressive steps to streamline operations and put Ron DeSantis in the strongest position to win this primary and defeat Joe Biden. NBC's Matt Dixon broke the news for us. He joins me now to talk more about this. So, Matt, walk us through your reporting. What is the campaign going for here, and why is it happening now?
Well, the term we keep hearing is, quote, lean. So there was a donor retreat in Utah this weekend where a bunch of donors got together and kind of got an update from the campaign. And they sort of orchestrated that this would be coming, that they needed to get smaller. There was 92 staffers on Governor DeSantis's first presidential campaign finance report, which is a really, really big number. So the idea was that they were burning through cash at a faster pace than they wanted to, and they needed to get smaller. And that's kind of what we're seeing. I think there are some who are surprised by the sheer number. The campaign has let go 38 people of the 92 originally staffed. And that's a significant number for a campaign that's been out there for less than 2 months. But they are acknowledging that they got too big too quick and they couldn't afford it.
Yeah, and it does seem like some of the moves, classic resets of a campaign that is struggling. You write in your piece that they want to focus more on earned media rather than expensive, large-scale events. How does that look? And is that something that Ron DeSantis particularly is the type of candidate that does well in an environment like that?
Yeah, for better or worse, their decision-making process is saying, hey, we should stop paying for these large rallies, these large campaign events that require a lot of staff, a lot of preparation, and a lot of money, and let's just give Ron DeSantis a mic. He's done, he did more mainstream media interviews, he's done more podcast interviews, and their calculation is that the spinoff, the quote sort of earned media or the coverage of Ron DeSantis doing those events is going to be enough and worth it to sort of tamp down some of the larger rally type things that we have seen. Now, if that works, or not to sort of close the gap he has with Donald Trump is yet to be seen. But their calculation is give Ron DeSantis a mic, let DeSantis be DeSantis, and somehow it's going to help him grow in polling and help sort of resurrect the campaign. And that's kind of what we're seeing, the early stages of that part of the reset.
So this is their second wave of firing. Are they done, or can they get any leaner at this point?
Well, they still have about 50 staffers, which is, in line with a lot of other presidential campaigns and probably on the upper side. So I think the answer is yes, but I don't know that we're going to see that at the moment. They got rid of about a dozen people last week, and roughly 25 or 26 was the number today. So they have definitely gotten lean quickly. I think there's probably more opportunities to cut if they wanted to, but one of the key points is the campaign manager and some of the top staffers that are sort of running the show, they're safe for now is our understanding. So this is a lot of sort of mid-tier sort of staffers throughout a couple divisions in the campaign. It's not necessarily a leadership shakeup, but it's definitely something of note for a campaign that's only been active for roughly 2 months.
Matt, I've been filling in on this program the last 5 days. I think we've done a story every single day about the DeSantis campaign reset. How long are they going to be resetting for? Is there concerns that this is the kind of the dominating story of the DeSantis campaign right now?
Absolutely. One of the person we talked to for the story we have up now is the idea that, a reset can't take 3 weeks. It's got to take one news cycle. You get one reset news cycle in a presidential sort of, election campaign cycle, and that's it. If it extends on beyond that, you become the, reset campaign as opposed to the presidential campaign that you ideally want to be. So I think the concern about ending this narrative about resets is very much real and very much being thought about. And that's why I don't think there's going to be any sort of massive shakeups, changes, or sort of firings in the near future, because they are very cognizant of the idea of sort of ending the, as you put it, reset news cycle.
All right, Matt Dixon, very plugged in with the DeSantis campaign. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And turning now to the latest on extreme weather. Earth is on track for its hottest July ever on record. And scientists say we're feeling the impact of climate change in real time. A new study from a group of climate scientists argues that the simultaneous heat across Europe, North America, and Asia would be, quote, virtually impossible without climate change, and that heat waves previously seen once every few hundred years could now happen every 15 years in the U.S., every 10 in Europe, and every 5 in China. This report comes as the current heat wave in the U.S. is set to expand from the south and west into the Midwest and Northeast this week. In southern Europe, the intense heat has brought with it even more danger as wildfires continue to rage across the Mediterranean in Greece and Algeria. The Algerian government announced today that 34 people have died in the fires. In Greece, thousands have been evacuated from the islands of Rhodes and Corfu, as emergency responders attempt to control the blazes. NBC News foreign correspondent Josh Letterman joins us now from Rhodes, Greece. Josh, what are you seeing on the ground there, and how has this usually idyllic island changed just over the past few days?
Well, Ryan, we've been here for several days now as this fire is now burning for a full week. And this idyllic island, you're right, it is a holiday hotspot, beachside destination, has turned into, in the areas affected by this fire, basically a war zone. You hear the constant drone throughout the day of those aircraft and helicopters that are dropping water on these fires. You hear sirens going by, the air filled with thick black smoke that in some cases is so heavy that today it blocked out the sun from where we were. We also saw today as an area that had been clear of fire suddenly was going up in flames, multiple little fires starting and residents and police rushing in, trying to put out those fires with their feet, hitting it with sticks, doing whatever they could to prevent it from really taking over the area. But it has been difficult to get a handle from hour to hour over whether this is getting worse or better. Earlier today, fire officials said it seemed like it had gotten more under control. They were worried about some hot spots. And then by the afternoon, the wind picked up, the heat picked up, and the fire was raging in large parts of this island once again.
What is the situation with evacuations right now? I mean, it is an island. I imagine that can't be easy. How many residents and tourists have been forced to leave?
Well, the official tally is still at 19,000. That was as of a few days ago, and the government here has not updated that. So by all indications, it is higher than that now. But those are mostly tourists. The residents, we have not talked to a single resident who said, look, I'm packing up and leaving the island. And these tourists, remember, they're here for a week, 10 days anyway. And so some certainly leaving earlier than they had planned to, but others are going home as their vacations end. So it's not necessarily an evacuation. So that makes it difficult to to ascertain the full extent of this, but we do know there are still people who are stranded without places to stay, who are sleeping in makeshift shelters on the floors of basketball stadiums, school classrooms, really trying to find anywhere they can that's safe right now.
Josh Letterman in one of the most beautiful places in the world, literally on fire. Josh, thank you. Coming up, an American ally in crisis. All eyes are on Israel following Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned judicial overhaul. We'll take you live to Tel Aviv. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Israel remains deeply divided after Parliament passed a controversial law yesterday limiting the powers of the country's Supreme Court. The unrest has gripped communities across the country as Air Force reservists say they will not report for duty, raising concerns about military readiness amid the continuing security threats posed by Hamas and Hezbollah. The Israeli Medical Association, which represents 97% of the country's doctors, also declared a strike, saying it will support the ongoing protests against the judicial reforms. And major Israeli newspapers published an all-black front page ad this morning, I should say. And at the bottom was white text that read, "A black day for Israeli democracy." Joining me now is Raf Sanchez. He is in Tel Aviv. And Natan Sachs. He is the director for the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Raf, let's start with you. Just tell us what the scene is like in Israel today.
Well, Ryan, the protests themselves have calmed down today, but that was after scenes of just almost unbelievable chaos overnight, both in Jerusalem and here in Tel Aviv. In the hours after that divisive legislation was pushed through Parliament, protesters were back on the streets. They were blocking major intersections. They were blocking highways in some cases, and the police using a lot of force to try to dislodge them. We saw officers in Jerusalem last night firing water cannon at protesters who were blocking streets in downtown. And someone actually drove a car into a crowd of protesters on a highway in central Israel. 3 people were injured there. Fortunately, no one seriously. The police have taken that driver into custody. The chaos on the streets has been replaced to a certain extent by chaos in the financial markets. Israel's stock market is down. The currency is down, and Moody's, the rating agency, issued an unusual report earlier today saying it fears that both the political and the social tensions are going to continue if Netanyahu's right-wing government pushes ahead with this planned judicial overhaul. The prime minister and his far-right finance minister rattled enough by this that they released a joint statement saying they believe this is only temporary turbulence and that the fundamentals of the Israeli economy are strong. Ryan.
And Raf, the last time that President Biden spoke out against the reforms was back in March, and Netanyahu called Biden out on Twitter, saying that Israel would not bend to pressures from abroad. Has there been any reaction to the White House on these latest condemnation?
You know, Ryan, Netanyahu and his right-wing government are in this kind of extraordinary situation that with all the incoming they're facing right now, criticism from the White House and the President of the United States is almost the least of their problems. As you said, they have this deeply divided country. They have an Israeli military that is seeing some of those divisions also. We have not yet heard much of a response from the Israeli government. It may be that Netanyahu has ordered his ministers not to speak out against the President of the United States. We did hear from Netanyahu's younger brother earlier today, who was on the radio. He's not a member of the government, but he questioned President Biden's mental state, which is something that we're used to hearing from the American right wing. It's now become kind of a trope on the Israeli right wing also. Netanyahu's younger brother later went back on TV and he walks those comments back. Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Raf Sanchez. Let's go to Natan now. I mean, what do you think? I mean, who do you think, I should say, is in control of the governing coalition right now? Is it Prime Minister Netanyahu, or does he actually have the ability to control his far-right government?
Well, he is in charge. He's the prime minister. It's convenient for him, of course, that he always presents that there's other forces and he's limited by his coalition. And to a certain degree, that's true. But we should not let him off the hook. He's the one calling the shots. And if he wanted to take a different tack, if he wanted to change policy, he could. Nonetheless, there are very strong other elements within the coalition. The coalition he built this time is by far the most right-wing extreme government in Israel's history. It includes 2 factions on the far right especially one of them that was persona non grata in previous governments, including those led by Netanyahu's own Likud party. And add to that his justice minister from his own party, the Likud, who is a hardcore ideologue, especially on these judicial issues. And there we see him beholden to them to a certain degree. I say again, cautiously, to a certain degree. If Netanyahu really wanted to change tack, he still could. He is the one in charge here.
So do you expect that Israel's Supreme Court will actually take up the case challenging its own power? And what are the implications if they do, and what if they don't?
It's a very difficult position Israel's in right now. There is already a petition to the Supreme Court against this legislation limiting the Supreme Court power. Of course, that is a constitutional crisis in waiting. It's likely they will take it up. I don't know which way they will go. I'm not a lawyer, but certainly there is question. They might try to address this. I think the bet would be that they probably do not address this issue, do not rule against it. But if they did, Israel would be in a real constitutional crisis in the sense that government officials would not know who they are supposed to obey, the court or the executive. And we've already heard some people, even the head of the Mossad, the Israeli External Security Service, mention a constitutional crisis potentially down the road, saying to his own employees inside the Mossad, don't worry, if there's a constitutional crisis, I will be on the right side. We don't know exactly what that means, but presumably that would be the rule of law.
So if the Supreme Court does have a third option, though, right? They could take a narrow interpretation of the law, not necessarily rule it out completely, but instead do something to try and curb its impacts. Would that quell the protests? Could that be the type of middle ground that maybe would give Israel an opportunity to see itself through this crisis?
The Supreme Court could do that. They could also use other rationales. What was struck down this week is one of the doctrines that the Supreme Court has used, the reasonableness doctrine. But there are other doctrines they could use in administrative review. But even if they did that, the protests, the unrest, the deep, deep fissure that Netanyahu has created in Israel, they're not about this specific law. They're about the sweeping agenda that the Netanyahu government has put in place to really undermine the whole idea of checks on executive power. In the Israeli system, there's no second chamber, there's no Senate, there's no presidential veto, there's no even Bill of Rights that's hard to change. There's really only one check on executive power or on any legislation that a small majority in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, would pass. And that check is the Supreme Court, using a hat called the High Court of Justice. This whole sweeping agenda by the Netanyahu government is to undermine that check. And that is why you're seeing this outpour, this amazing outpour of demonstrators, of mobilized people of all ages and all walks of life coming out to demand a simple thing. Their cry is democracy. And what they are demanding is that there won't be an executive with unbridled power, even if that executive represents a majority, perhaps a temporary majority, perhaps a longer-term one. It does not have license to simply do whatever it wants with no limit on what it could do to a minority or what it could do in corruption or what it could do in any other way. In Israel, unfortunately, the only check is the Supreme Court, and it's much more than just this doctrine or just this bill this week. That's why you see this energy. They're not all legal scholars out there in the streets. There are people fighting for what they see as their own democracy, their own state.
We only have about 30 seconds for this answer, and it may be a complex one, so I apologize. But has there ever been an issue that has divided Israel as deeply as this one? Obviously, it's had its share of crises, but, kind of put this in historical context for us.
Domestically, Israel has never been more divided. This has been the low point, domestically speaking. Of course, it's had external threats and wars. But domestically speaking, Israel has never been more divided or galvanized, even in the days of the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, when Netanyahu was leader of the opposition. This trumps that by far. We are seeing Israelis distrust each other and feel that the social contract is being broken, but also that enormous energies are being unleashed to try and perhaps repair that.
Excellent context. Natan Sachs, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And after the break, the story of Emmett Till and what President Biden's decision to establish a national monument in his and his mother's honor means for the history of our nation and the ongoing fight for racial justice. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. President Biden today honoring a teen whose death helped galvanize the civil rights movement. The president signed a declaration establishing a national monument dedicated to Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till Mobley. Emmett was just 14 when he was kidnapped while visiting family in Mississippi in August of 1955. He was tortured and killed after a white woman accused him of whistling at her. In his remarks today honoring Till's legacy, the president also invoked efforts in some conservative-leaning states seeking to change how black history is taught in schools.
The time when there are those who seek to ban books, bury history, we're making it clear, crystal clear. While darkness and denialism can hide much, they erase nothing. They can hide, but they erase nothing. We can't just choose to learn what we want to know. We have to learn what we should know.
The monument will consist of 3 sites in 2 states, Illinois, where Emmett Till was from, and Mississippi, where he was killed. And I'm joined now by Keith Mays, who's an associate professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. Keith, thanks for being here. Just tell us the significance of making this designation now.
Oh, Ryan, this is extremely significant because it's taken the better part of 60 plus years to recognize the legacy and the horror of the Till lynching. And it's interesting that we are in an era where Black history is part of a larger political battleground. And so I'm so glad that President Biden is doing this. He signed this into law, but he also signed into law last year in March, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill that the NAACP and so many other Black groups have been fighting for decades and never got. So Ryan, this is a significant a moment in Black history as well as American history.
Are you surprised it took this long? I mean, you say more than 60 years.
Yes, because there have been organizations fighting to get Emmett Till recognized at a national level. He's always been someone who has been part of not only a civil rights struggle, but an understanding why that moment in time was important to galvanize the modern civil rights movement. Brown v. Board was in May 1954, but shortly thereafter, 1 year after, in August of 1955, there was the lynching of Emmett Till. And it was not a mistake that Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, and about 4 or 5 months later, in December of 1955. You could connect all the dots, Ryan. May 1954, August 1955, and December 1955. All of those provided the backdrop to galvanize a whole generation to march and move for Black rights in the 1950s and the 1960s. Yes, it's taken this long.
And are you worried that most Americans don't understand the connections for all those significant civil rights moments have to the story of Emmett Till?
They do not, unfortunately, because as you can see, in the case of Florida, there are those who still do not want to teach this history. It's interesting that when we talk about white mob violence, we have to caveat it with false narratives of Black violence that may have accompanied such white mob violent acts, and much of that is about Black responses to white mob violence. I'm not quite sure what the governor of Florida was suggesting there about teaching 2 sides of the history. But to answer your question, we do not know the significance of a single event like the Till lynching. Nevertheless, all the other events that I just mentioned.
You know, I was horrified to learn that in the past, markers in honor of Emmett Till have been vandalized. Some even shot at, that they've been had to replace over and over again. How will this monument be received once it's established in Mississippi?
Well, I think that there are those who unfortunately want to desecrate Black history monuments and to sort of push back on the advancement of Black history as though Black history is not part of American history. I would hope that they protect the monument in Mississippi as They will, I'm quite sure, in Chicago, as well as other places in the country, whether it's Washington, D.C. on a national mall or other places as well. We have to insist on telling a proper story of American history as it happened. This is not wokeism. This is about telling the truth as it occurred.
And so to that end, what would you recommend the Biden administration do next to help educate Americans about these important moments in the civil rights movement?
I think he really has to connect past with present. I think it's important for President Biden to see and understand that the civil rights struggle is ongoing, and that when organizations and leaders call for a press for voting rights or for other kinds of civil rights, that this is part of the larger history that's been ongoing even beyond the 50s and 60s. The Black freedom struggle is long and wide. It started back when Africans were taken off those slave ships back in the 16 and 1700s. And though we often disconnect those moments that took place in previous centuries, they do bear on today. And I think the real reason why we are having such a struggle with maintaining them is that there are those on the right who understand the importance of these events, and that's why they push back on them. I always talk to my students about revolution, but white counter-revolution. The white right is always looking for ways to push back and to make these gains temporary. And President Biden and other elected officials have to understand that the struggle is ongoing, that it never is static, it never stops. It has to. We have to remain vigilant in our fight.
All right, Professor Mays, thank you for making those connections for us today. We appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And still to come, an NBC News exclusive. We are on the ground in West Africa with an inside look at how U.S. forces are training Nigerian soldiers in the war on terror. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning now to an NBC News exclusive and the new front line in the war on terror, Western Africa. U.S. Special Forces are training troops in Niger to fight the main terrorist organization in the region. And NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube was given special access to that training mission. Courtney joins us now live from Niger. So, Courtney, who or what poses the greatest threat to U.S. national security in West Africa?
So it's really two main groups. The major one here, specifically in Niger, but also in West Africa, and specifically in the coastal part of West Africa, is called JNIM. It's an al-Qaeda affiliate. But there's also a threat from an arm of ISIS called the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. So both of these groups are really squeezing in, trying to move into new areas and locations that they haven't been in recent years. That's part of the reason that the U.S. military is here in Niger, also in Benin, where we spent a couple of days before we got here. The mission here is to train the local Nigerian Special Operations Forces, and doing that is U.S. military Special Operations Forces. They train them on everything from detecting and disabling IEDs or roadside bombs to clearing houses. And while they're training them during the day, these same Nigerian forces are going out and conducting these missions at night, going to the front lines and trying to find these terrorist fighters. And this is a vulnerable population that they're preying on here, Ryan. The people here have very little. Nearly everyone in this country lives below the poverty line. Millions of them are hungry. And ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates, they know that, and they try to move in on these vulnerable people.
And Courtney, you've covered U.S. Special Forces operations in Somalia. Is this mission similar to that?
So, I mean, every place is a little bit different. That's a different group called Al-Shabaab that they're focused on in the eastern part of Africa. But the reality is the overall situation is similar in that there's a difficult humanitarian situation here in Benin, in a lot of these neighboring countries, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, as in Somalia. And these terror networks, they move into these areas and they force the local population to either join up or flee. It creates an enormous problem with refugees, displaced persons in these countries, and it only makes the difficult humanitarian situations even worse.
Okay, Courtney Kube, live from Africa for us. Courtney, thank you so much for that report. We appreciate it. Chuck will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.